So, hi, this is my story. And actually, it's the story of my career until now. And to understand that story, you need to know more about me. So, I studied history and linguistics in Ghent at the university in Belgium. And I have 2 kids. The kids are totally irrelevant to the story or to the rest of the story, but I like them a bit. So, I mention them once in a while. So, like any story, my story starts in the beginning. It's a good place for a story to start. And it starts at my first day on the job. I applied to a job that was looking for enthusiastic people. I'm enthusiastic, with a passion for IT. And I was going to be a tester. So I arrived there on my first day, a brand new me, a new version of me, wearing a shirt for the first time in my life. Well, on a regular basis, and I was clean-shaven every day for at least a week, and then I gave up completely. What? Was it peer pressure? No, it's just laziness and honesty. Okay. On my first day, I was introduced to testing. So I learned everything there was to know about testing. I learned about bugs and how it's my job as a tester to find bugs, to make sure I locate them before the worst things happen. And in order to do so, I needed to know about test plans. There should be a test plan ready when I start testing. And at the end of the cycle, there should be a test report. I wasn't going to be writing those. That was something they stressed from the very beginning. It's not my job. It's going to be a test manager. Someday, maybe, Andreas, you can be a test manager, but not right now. No, you need to know more about requirements, because you need requirements to test. And I was taught how to interpret those requirements in order to create test cases. Sequential steps. Step 1, do this, and check this. Step 2, do this, check this. And finally, one of the most important things that I was taught was that I needed to prevent money loss. Because a bug found in production, which is this little graph, is twice as expensive as a bug found during testing. So it was my job as a tester to prevent money from being lost. And that was a very heavy duty for me to be aware of. So I went off to my first assignment. I was a consultant. And it worked well. Everything was going okay. I did my testing. I created my test cases. I did analysis of requirements. And it all worked. But it was boring. I mean, I didn't see any challenge. So for me, it wasn't doing it. So enter the first chapter of my story. I went at a time that I was thinking about quitting, about changing my job, because I was a historian and I wasn't doing anything with history. I went to a conference very much like this one. And there was the usual talk about test cases, about requirements, about test plans. But there was this one guy in front, a Belgian blonde testing guru, who might chair this very conference. And he was talking. And while I was sitting there, I could feel something changing inside me. So he was talking about agile. He was talking about the Agile Manifesto, explaining what Agile teams do, how they work. And inside of me, all of the resistance that had been building up towards the models that I knew, that I had been taught, like the V model. It's one of the first things that I learned. This is how you do development. This is how you do testing. In parallel, not together, in parallel. And I could feel while he was talking inside of me, those models, all those concepts being crumbled up into a big ball of smelly, nasty stuff, ready to be thrown out. And he talked about change. He talked about how he was transitioning, he and his team were transitioning from a more traditional development context towards a more agile approach. And this also included testing. And at the same time, and at that time when I was hearing that, little me inside of me went like, yes, this is exactly what I need right now, because I was in another place. I was not in a good place. And at the same time, while he was talking about change, I was undergoing change as well. I was starting to learn about IT in evening college, starting to learn how to code, and on my job, to make it less boring, I was starting to create small little tools to help me with my testing and to make my life less boring as well. So, while he was talking about change in approaches to testing, I was also taking a changing path as well. So, I knew there was stuff out there. So I started reading blogs, started reading books about testing, about how testing relates to the development processes, what kinds of testing there are. And I started thinking about testing. Started thinking for the first time, thinking about what had I been taught during those 4 weeks where I learned all there is to know about testing, or at least that's what they told me at that point. And I was starting to question that, based on what I found on the internet, based on what I found in books. And in 2009, 2010, I found an article by Brett Petticord about testing schools. It was actually a conference talk in 2003, so it was already 6 to 7 years old at that time. And he talked about testing schools. He talked about 4 different views on testing that existed out there and that you could use in your day-to-day work as a sort of as baggage. This comes with a disclaimer, because those testing schools that he defined, schools of software testing as he called them, are stereotypes. So they are abstractions of the real thing. The things that I'm going to present in a moment, don't take them at face value. Take them with a little grain of salt, as we say in Belgium, because they are stereotypes. They are models, and inherently wrong, because they are models. Okay, so he talked at that point in 2003 about 4 different schools, 4 different ways of thinking about testing. He had the analytical school, the factory school, the QA school, and the context-driven school. I was going to explain everything about the analytical school as well, but yesterday evening I wasn't at a party, that's why I look rather fresh. Yesterday I decided I was not going to talk about the analytical school, because it's a very academic way of thinking about testing. It's not something used in the field a lot. So I'm going to start with the factory school, because that was the school that I knew. That was the school that I had been taught during those 4 weeks, more or less, about what testing is. And I'll explain it with their biggest idea is that testing measures progress. It measures the progress of the development, measures the progress of the entire product. That's the biggest idea. And it should be managed, so we need a test manager. Of course, we need a test manager to manage us, because we can be trusted with things as important as a test plan or a test report. And it needed to be cost efficient, because we need to save money in the end. That's our mission. And the question that often comes back within this type of thinking about testing is, what kind of metrics are we going to use? How are we going to report our progress towards the stakeholders? Are we going to report number of bugs found? And if that's on the decline, then we're making good progress. Or are we going to report on number of test cases? Number of test cases created, number of test cases executed, number of passing test cases. At some point, we want to talk about how are we on the schedule, and that's what this type of school typically talks about. And they talk about requirement traceability, because requirements are needed in testing, at least in this point of view. They talk about a requirement, and you need at least 1 test case that covers that requirement. Again, if you can say, I covered 100% of that requirement, it shows progress. So that's very important in their way of thinking. And it's a very formal way of thinking about testing. Everything needs to be written and logged, etc. So that's the factory school of testing. Then comes the QA school of testing. In most companies, the QA is either a different department or one guy, that guy. And they see testing as checking whether or not the process is being followed. And it's often compared to a sort of testing police, where they police the developers, where they even police other testers to see whether or not they're doing what the process prescribes them. And the question they often ask is the process okay? Is it a good process? Do we need to change anything in the process? Not do we need to change anything in the testing, but in the process, very process-oriented, and also a very formal way of testing. When I talk about the QA, I often think about the gatekeeper. They are the last gate for the product, the last quality gate. Before the product can be released, they need to talk, they need to say, yes, it's okay. And when I was creating this presentation, the idea of Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, standing on the ledge, holding a staff, holding a sword, facing the mighty Balrog coming at him, and he's shouting, "You shall not pass unless you have all signatures." That was the idea that I was having during the QA discussion. Then finally, there's the context-driven testing school. And it's actually Brett Petticourt's own school, so there was a bit of favoritism in his description there, so it will come off as the coolest one. So, what they say is that testing it needs to find important bugs, and important is defined as important for the stakeholders. So we need to focus on the things that are important for the stakeholders. And they also stress that testing is inherently a mental process. It's a thinking process. It's something that only humans can do, and it's something that we're very well equipped to do, because even my children, who I do mention apparently, they do testing all the time. They test my nerves, they test their toys, but it comes natural to them, testing the world. So it's inherently human, and it provides information, and that's our biggest deliverable, information for the stakeholders, finding important bugs. And the question they often ask is, what kind of test is most valuable at this point? So it could be different answers at different stages during a project, or even different answers over projects. So the context isn't fixed, so there are no things as best practices. Best practices are rejected. There are good practices in given contexts. One of their stressing points, and Simon, who is already waiting to give his speech, will talk about exploratory testing in about 20, 25 minutes. So I'll keep it short and let him correct me. They stress exploratory testing. So if you have the formal kinds of testing from the other kind of schools, the context-driven community or the context-driven school says, no, we need to do more exploring. We need the tester to start exploring the application, hunting bugs, learning about the application. And there are a lot of definitions on exploratory testing, and I chose the simplest definition there was, just to get the message across, and that is exploratory testing is executing tests and designing them at the same time. So constantly learning, very fast learning about the application, about the functionality, and it's incredibly fun to do, as Simon will probably most likely demonstrate in a moment. So that's very important in their way of thinking. And it's not a formal approach. You don't need to do exploratory testing, or you can't do exploratory testing by writing your test cases beforehand. And you don't need requirements. Then there's the Agile school. It wasn't available in 2003, so this is my own version of the school, but it was the school that tickled me to start thinking about testing. They talk about testing in an Agile context. So you have the context-driven testing, and Agile testing is specifically for the Agile context. And what is so different with the other schools is that it stresses the team. The Agile team is one team. And the other schools, lesson in the context-driven school, there was more an emphasis on testing being one group, development being another group, the users or the business being even a different group. And in the Agile model, it's one big team. They all come together and work together on the same product to go forward. So that's important. And the question they ask most is, how can I add value? How can I bring value for my team? And they do so as a T-shaped tester. So that's one of their viewpoints. It says that as a tester, you should have a specialty in testing. It should be your main goal. and main purpose in the team. But at the same time, you should be able to talk to the users or to the business in their language. You should know about the domain. And if possible, you should also help the developers by maybe checking their documentation, by maybe talking to them, that kind of stuff. It's not restricted to just testing. And you can't be a T-shaped tester in a normal team. You need to work in a T-shaped team. So even the developers do development as their core function, but they also do testing. They also talk to the users. So that's very important. The same for the users. They also help in testing. They also help in development by answering questions, etc. So agile. Then finally, there's a sixth school. Well, it was actually called an unschool. It's the oblivious unschool. It's the school where people new to testing belong to. They don't know anything about testing. Or people dropped into a testing position by someone up high because everyone can test. That's sometimes a motto I hear. And they don't know what they're doing. So their main question is, what am I doing? I have no idea. So it's always better to be in one of those 5 schools than in the oblivious unschool. But the fact that you're at a conference already means that you have some idea of what you're doing. Okay, so at the end of that reading and thinking, I found a home. I found my religion. I'm a context-driven tester. So hi, I'm Andreas. I'm a context-driven tester. But at the same time, the agile stuff had also seemed kind of interesting, so I didn't want to pin down on the context-driven only. So occasionally I go on a vacation to the agile school. I read up. So enter a new chapter in my career, enter a new chapter in my life. I was content. I was comfortable. It's good to know where you belong as a person. And while I was doing my work, over the years, I had been growing more from a manual testing job towards, because I was changing, because I was studying development, more into a technical world. I was doing performance testing, functional test automation on the service level, that kind of stuff. So I started noticing patterns. I was still happy at my job. That's a big difference from before. I found testing boring before. Now I was always talking about testing, and I was actually the enthusiast that they were looking for in 2008. So, but I started noticing pattern. I was more and more behind my computer listening to music, and when I was talking to people, I started using more and more technical terms. I was starting to talk about Ruby, RSpec, Git, HTML, CSS, that kind of stuff. So less testing, more technical. And those implicit patterns became very explicit about 6 months ago. It's actually the trigger to give this presentation, and I blamed her for it afterwards. We were working in the company on a new feature, a big feature, and I had been testing it. I had been doing exploratory testing in the beginning, doing some manual testing as well. Well, just scripted testing because we needed some trace. And I was doing test automation for that new functionality. And all of a sudden, when it's near finished, the documentation guy comes over to us. And I'm sitting next to my team leader. And he asks, OK, I need to document this new feature. Who can I talk to? And because I'm sitting there and because I'm enthusiastic, I'm already leaning over. It's me. You want to talk to me. And my boss flat out says, no, Andreas is too technical. Don't talk to him. He knows too much of what's going on underneath. He knows what is going on at the database level, what is going on in the code, and all the stuff that could go wrong. We don't want that in the documentation. He'll only confuse you. And I was like, no. I'm still cool. I'm still a tester. I can still talk like a tester and talk like a user and think like a user. She said, no, you're too technical. And then in times of stress, what do? You go back to what you know. You go back to your religion. And I started looking online to find answers, because surely there must be other people facing my kind of problems. And all I found was tweets like this by Michael Bolton, saying that test automation is not testing, which is a paraphrased sentence. He never actually said that, and it's more nuanced than this, but that was the feeling that I had. And little me went like, no! I was panicking. It was the same kind of panic, a different kind of panic actually than years before that, but I was losing my religion, and that's the title. So, no, okay. So I was panicking, and I did what I did a few years before that. I started reading again. So enter chapter 4. I started reading again about test automation and the relationship with testing. So again, blogs, books, and thinking about my position. What had changed? Because I had evolved, and I had been doing what I still think today, are the right things, but I had been doing so without knowing if they were right, without the theoretical baggage that I needed. So I started reading, and I found a lot, because the internet, people, it's big and scary. And I tried to make a little schema of what I found about test automation. And it looked like a giant Picasso when I completed it. So I decided for this presentation I'm going only to handle a few aspects of it and the things that I find interesting. There's more, but there are things that particularly tickled me, that spoke to me as a person, because I had my trajectory throughout my career, and those things rang true for me. So, and I'm going to do it in the same style. I'm also going to focus on the different schools. So, the context-driven community, they talk about the difference between testing and checking. And it's a very interesting difference. They say that testing, which I already said, is evaluating a product by learning. And it's something humans do. My kids do it, remember? And checking is evaluating a product by applying algorithmic rules. It's an if-then-else situation. It's very simple, something that a computer can do. Not always should do, but can do. Important difference. And I can explain this by a little example. It's always the login screen, I know, sorry. But let's imagine we have an automated script running. And it's running, and it's entering a username and an invalid password. At some point, it's going to click the login button, and it's going to check whether or not the correct text appears. Wrong user password. It's in red, probably you can't read it, but that's what we're expecting. And it's a very, very simple test, very true-false, binary. It's there or it isn't there, so if it's there, it's passed. If it's not there, it's a failed test. So that's a script. That's a check. We can see that. But if a human was testing this, the same functionality, and the title appears, saying a small insult towards the user trying to log in, this is something that any human would see immediately, because he's checking something, but at the same time he's seeing the context. He's noticing all the things around it, because how often does it happen as a tester that you're trying to check a small portion of the application, and after half an hour you find yourself at the other side of the application, because you found interesting stuff, and you just went with it. That's something that a script or a check or an automated test can't do. So a very interesting distinction. Theoretical, but interesting. How do those two relate? They aren't opposites. They actually live together, because good checking is part of good testing. There can be bad checking. There can be uninteresting checks or even stupid checks. For example, if you have the scenario from before, there are 1,000 variations of wrong passwords, but maybe only 5 of them are really interesting. So those are stupid checks. There are good checks, and the testing itself is a human thing. Then it all comes down to what you see test automation doing for you. If you see test automation as a huge bug-finding machine, where you just pour your test scripts into, and you expect that at the end of the day it poops a number of bugs, then you're not in for a good result. It won't add that much value for you. So that's not an approach that I would choose. But how I see test automation, it's more as a change detection kit. It alerts you of change, and that's all it does. So imagine that you have 1,000 automated tests running every night, and all of them are green every night, and then all of a sudden one of them turns red. That's a change, and that's interesting. That's information. That's what we're looking for as testers. It's information. Something has happened. Maybe the code is wrong, maybe the test is wrong. anything can be happening at that point. I'm not passing judgment. It's not a bug per se, but it's interesting. It's a change. I want to investigate this, and that's where testing comes in again. So we have a check. It changed. We need to investigate. And that's where my testing instincts come in handy again. Then there's the idea, and I already mentioned it, that you can automate checks. That automation should be a tactic. It should be something that you could do. It's not a ritual. It's not something that you should do. In a number of other schools, it's more or less an obsession. You should do test automation because it will save time, it will return your investment, etc. They say it could be interesting, it can be interesting. So that's, for me, that's very important. Because even though I enjoy doing all the technical stuff, I don't think it's always necessary. Then there's a factory school. So the very formal school, they are, no surprise, very process-driven when they're talking about test automation. I read the ISTQB expert syllabus for the technical test analyst from A to Z. It was surprisingly interesting. Don't mock me. And it's very process-driven. So they have this idea that a test automation project is like a development project. And I was reading this as one of the first lines somewhere in section 5. And I was reading and said, yes, I agree. And then, of course, they went overboard. They said you need this kind of documentation and these kinds of requirements, requirements. And I lost them there. But in essence, I agree with them, because test automation is like development. You need to apply the same good practices, like source control, reviews. I mean, code reviews are very important. Avoid code duplication. That kind of stuff will only make your life easier in the end. So it is, in a sense, like a development project, but not like they see it, for me at least. The second thing I found was a distinction they made between the tester and the test automator. So what they say is, you have on the one hand the technical tester, the technical test analyst they call it, and on the other hand you have for the sake of the argument, I'll call it the normal tester. And the job of the technical tester, the nerdy guy, me, is to provide framework, to provide tools for the normal tester to use. And the normal tester will use it to create test scripts and give feedback in the form of, we need this kind of functionality for the next sprint or for the next iteration of our product. So it's, they work together, but separately. And that's the thing that struck me the most. There was a wall between those two. I felt like, as a technical guy, I wasn't allowed to learn anything about the product. The only thing that I should be focused with was the technical nitty-gritty details. While on the other hand, the normal testers, they shouldn't be allowed to know about the technical part. It's two realms, keep it separate, that's easier. While I don't agree with this approach, it is interesting, because it brings to surface a problem. The whole test automation is a scary problem that a lot of testers face, and in nearly all of my projects, when I'm talking to testers who mainly do manual testing, they all think of test automation as something scary, as something too difficult for them. And this is the solution that the factory school had, to have a clear division of roles. It's not my solution, but it does address a specific problem. And they have a lot of tips and tricks. So I explicitly mention this because even though I don't agree with most of them, they do have a very practical approach. If you want to learn about test automation quick, just read the syllabus. It will read it with a critical eye, but it will contain a lot of useful things as well. So they talk about the test automation triangle. They say, if you're going to do test automation, focus on the unit tests first. Probably that's going to be the developers, but focus on that first, because there was fast feedback. It's easy to write, well, more or less. Then on the next level, focus on the service tests, on the API level. And finally, do some UI automation, because that's the hardest to do, the slowest, and the least interesting feedback. So a clear distinction. They have process. I'm not going to go into that. They have examples of approaches. They have the data-driven approach and the keyword-driven approach. I'm not going to go too deep into those two approaches, but they are practical ways of thinking about test automation. Again, in the whole tester versus technical tester relationship. So in both of these roles, the technical work is done by one person, and the actual creating of tests is done by the domain expert, by the tester. Then there's the agile school, and they stress continuous testing. One of the models that you see a lot in companies is that when a developer checks in new code, he's created something new, it's checked in, and then the build machine picks that up, starts compiling, and starts running all tests, all the automated tests, in order to have fast feedback. Now, all of the schools talk about feedback because that's the main idea of testing and test automation. But why did I place it under the Agile school? Because they talk about fast feedbacks. They are talking about minutes, while the other schools just talk about feedback. They want their feedback in minutes, because that's what they need to get faster releases, and etc. Another interesting thing is they have a technique called specification by example. I don't know if this is familiar to you, but it is business-oriented. So it is a clear language that anyone can read. In this case, it's going to be plain English, but in your case, it will probably be Polish. And it's facing the business, so it's not technical. And why do they use examples? Because if you have a complex problem, if you throw enough examples at it, it becomes easy to understand. It's easy for the brain to just read examples and figure out, okay, this is how it's going to work, instead of a bundled requirement which is hard to go through and you need to think a lot. If you just read the examples, oh, okay, this is how it goes. Another advantage of this is that you have one version of the truth. So instead of the business writing their business requirements and the development team creating their development documents and the testers creating test cases, you have one version of the truth where everyone is collaborating on. That's interesting. This is an example. Notice that it's very clear and unambiguous. I'll go through it in a moment. It's simple language, and there's no room for mistakes. So, what you see here, this is a little example to create a user in a new piece of software. And it's always the same format, or it can be the same format. It's not necessary. This is the cucumber format or the gherkin format. And it's that given I am logged in as an administrator, the preconditions, this is what needs to be in place when I'm starting this test. When I create a new user, the action, then I expect that the user that I have created does not have admin rights by default. It's a fairly mundane example. And there will be a lot of these examples going around for creation of new users. For example, if I create a new user, the first time he logs in, he needs to change his password. That's a simple example. And if you have a lot of these, you have the entire functionality covered. And the upside to this is automation ready. This can be automated on the unit testing level quite easily, on the service level, if that's an option, and on the UI level. So these steps can just be parsed and translated into something that actually does something. So again, you have the distinction. This is for the non-technical people, the business and the testers, and probably development or one of the testers will create the framework that actually does something with these texts. Very interesting, and they try to solve the same problem. Again, the test automation is a scary problem. This is their solution to it. Now, after reading all this and thinking about this, I have to find a solution. So this is my synthesis of all what I found. And I found that none of these schools, for the technical me, really fit. I had hoped that I could just stay within the context-driven way of thinking, but I see value in all of them. And the thing they did for me was they confirmed my already existing beliefs, because I pride myself in thinking that I'm always doing the right things. When I look back to 5 years ago, I did horrible things. but I thought at the time that I was doing the right things. Probably in 5 years from now, I'll think that I'm doing horrible things right now, but I'm fairly confident now that I'm doing what is right. And these readings, they confirmed my implicitly held beliefs. I was doing things, but now I have a reason why. I can explain why I'm doing these things. So this is my version of what I learned. And it comes back to my story again. So I found my new church. It's my home, small home in Ghent, where my 2 children live, and my wife. And I think it applies to me, because it's my story, of course, but I think it applies for most testers in a testing project. If you're going to start testing, start at the beginning. Like any story, it's good to start your journey in the beginning as well. So don't go to Automation Mountain or Automation Plateau before you've climbed Mount Manual. There are stories out there of managers insisting that everything needs to be automated from the start, but that's insane. In some contexts, it could be a good idea, but in general, I think if you don't do any testing yet, don't start with test automation. So once you've climbed Mount Manual and you're on top of Mount Manual and you're confident that you're doing the right things as a tester, even as a technical tester like me, I'd still first do manual testing. For my current job, which I've been doing for 2.5 years now, I insisted that I was going to do 3 months of manual testing first. Just exploratory testing, seeing what was out there, knowing what the application did. They wanted me to start right away with the scripting and the technical stuff because that's what they expected me to do, but I said no. First, I need to understand what this is all about before I can do this in a good way. So when you're on top of Mount Manual, you should see up in the sky a huge pop-up appearing. Are you sure? Do you want to go to Test Automation Mountain? Because it is a bit scary, and it's not always necessary. 2 days ago, when coming over to Poland, I was talking with a colleague, and he told me that one of his managers had a very good idea. The product was done. There was no work to be done on the product anymore. The product was finished. It's a rare thing that for a product to be finished, but in that case, it was finished. And then the manager said, now it's time to automate it. So they weren't going to change the product, ever, but now was the time to automate it, because it's stable, and it seemed like a good idea. And we were both like, what? Why? So that's why the pop-up is needed, because managers often think that test automation is a must, but like we discussed, it's a tactic. So once you decide to go there, just go straight up Mount Automation or Automation Plateau, but do it as a T-shaped tester. And embrace technical you and manual you, because they can be together in one person. And still, I do a lot of manual testing as well, because I enjoy it. I enjoy exploring new functionality, but I enjoy the coding as well. And there is this problem of the test automation is scary, and my solution is that every tester, at least, should be an automator, and should try to be partly manual tester, partly automator. And that is challenging, because test automation is scary. And that's why I think it's a good advice, when you're going up to that mountain, you get a Sherpa. In the project that I'm right now, I am that Sherpa. I was the first one to go up that mountain. I was up that mountain for a few months, and then I said to the other testers, join me. And gradually, over time, through coaching, a lot of coaching, because it took me about 1.5 years of coaching so that everyone could feel comfortable doing test automation on different degrees. So, and it works for us. Everyone is contributing. So everyone is more or less 50-50, 50% of his time doing test automation and 50% of his time doing manual testing. And it works for the team. It works very well. Then finally, if you're taking that journey up Automation Mountain, know the mountain, understand the mountain. I could even say be the mountain, but that's a bit too dramatic. Know that there's something as unit testing. Know that it exists. Know that it's probably interesting for developers to start doing unit testing, if they don't already. know that they exist and know that you can see them as well. You, as a tester, can ask to see those unit tests. You can review them. You can even make suggestions. It's no longer a distinction where in 2017 I can talk to any developer and I can talk in his language. And it's not a problem. Know that there's a service level, the API level, the database level, where you can do a lot of interesting checks. Those checks are fast, and it's in the language that the developers use. So that's an extra added value, because the jump from here to here is less high. And if you're going to go all the way to the top, to the snowy peaks of UI automation, beware that it's going to be a tricky road. It can be rewarding, but it can be tricky as well. So, with one of the famous lines from the Losing My Religion song from REM, oh no, oh, sorry, customize everything, sorry. This is the last point. This isn't the truth. You should customize your approach. And finally, oh no, I've said too much. This is the end, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them, or in the speakers lounge in a few moments.